to the Natural Health Podcast, where we bring awareness to sustainable health in the business hustle space. Natural Health Podcast is perfect for the high-performing, business-minded individuals who want to work with their biochemistry to achieve success and optimal health. It's Friday, which means it's time for friends sharing facts about health, business, and overall success. In today's episode, we talk to Danny Greeves. Danny is a childhood and relationship trauma expert, best known for using groundbreaking psychological techniques to help his clients move on from painful past trauma, boost confidence, conquer self-expression, and achieve their dreams. He has worked with thousands of people and corporate clients, including Google, where he provided their employees with mindset training. Danny has authored multiple books, including Accelerated Trauma Resolution, a step-to-step guide to overcoming trauma. For many years, Danny struggled with anxiety and low self-esteem and stress and couldn't form healthy relationships due to various traumas. He often resorted to food or alcohol to get away from his problems until his late 20s, when he reached a point where he was desperately wanting to change. In under a year, he went from unhappy, overweight and single to calm, confident, enjoying a loving relationship with the woman who's now his wife, doing a job he loves and thriving in all areas of life. Danny is currently studying a diploma of cosmology. He enjoys playing pool and was the Coventry Uni Student Champion. And he also has a 4-month-old son and he works from home. Welcome to the Natural Health Podcast, Danny.
Thanks for having me and for summing up my life so succinctly.
You are absolutely welcome. So you're currently studying a diploma in cosmology. Is that how you pronounce it? Am I pronouncing it right?
Yes, yeah, that's the one.
How is that going?
It's just really interesting. Like, I remember sort of being 5 or 6 and just being fascinated by space and the planets and stars, and it was something that my dad had an interest in and my nephew is interested in it. So there's something that just sort of runs through our family in terms of an interest, and I finally found a course that I could do in bite-sized chunks, and it just sort of helps me expand my thinking, puts things into perspective, I think.
That's amazing. So do we have a favorite planet at the moment?
A favorite planet? Well, I think one of the most interesting planets is Venus, because it's so hot, it's so toxic, there's so much going on there, and we don't know a lot about what goes on under the surface. So I think that it kind of reflects some people who are struggling with trauma or issues where they've got this violence or they've got this toxicity in their outer world, but really they don't know what's going on underneath. So that's probably one that sort of resonates with me.
I love how you sum that up. Absolutely brilliant. Danny, before we get into today's podcast, which I'm so excited about, let's learn a little bit about you and what got you to where you are here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think with many people who are therapists or in the coaching space, it wasn't something that was planned. It wasn't something that when I was at university or when I was thinking about university, I was like, I'm going to be a therapist. I'm going to be a coach. So I've known from a really young age that I loved learning about the nervous system. So my sort of first part of my journey was studying physiotherapy. So I was working with people struggling with chronic pain, trying all of these different mechanisms or modalities and struggling to have a breakthrough. And as I was studying that topic and working with people with chronic pain, I branched out in terms of what I was studying. And first of all, I came across a neurosurgeon who helped me to look at and understand the impact specific emotions have on the physical body. And at that time, I had chronic pain in my left shoulder, so I was trying to help myself as well as others. And that really opened my eyes to the idea that in some cases, could the origin of chronic pain be an emotional basis? And that then led me to learning more about emotions. And then I reached out, found someone who works in the trauma space. And in a very short space of time, my shoulder pain started to improve. All of the other aspects that you kind of touched on in the introduction started to change as well. And just very, very quickly, I realized that I'm in the wrong game. So I then transitioned into therapy and coaching, and that kind of led me along this path.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that's what happens to most of us healers. We kind of end up here and we're like, how did we get here?
Yeah.
What am I doing? So it's interesting that you actually were open enough to be like, you know what? Emotions may be impacting physical pain. Was that a big surprise for you, or was that something that you kind of thought about previously?
It was completely new. It was particularly from my sort of physiotherapy background, where we're looking at tissue damage causing pain, particularly sort of 5, 10 years ago. The idea of there being an emotional component was actually quite alien to me. And so I was getting all of these different types of physical work, but my pain just wasn't shifting. And I was almost at that point where I was like, I'll give anything a go. Okay, let's just see what happens. And just by being open enough to start to explore it, I very quickly saw that actually there's some really strong connections here. So yeah, it was more through having exasperated myself through everything else, and it was a new concept, definitely.
Yeah, and you're not the only one that says, you know what, I've given so many things a shot. Why not try this? It sounds a bit out of the ordinary, out of something that I would go for first line therapy. But hey, let's give it a shot. And look where it landed you now.
Yeah, exactly. And there are upsides and downsides. So sometimes we reach the point where we'll try some potentially quite wacky and really poorly supported things to try and help. Unfortunately, in my case, it had a neurosurgeon background. It was grounded in hypnotherapy and sort of linguistics. So I felt confident enough that it was a sideways step, but it wasn't sort of what I'd consider sort of not supported in any way.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then you ended up in being a trauma expert. And how did that go? Like, was that just the next step? Was it something that happened in your life that you realized and you're like, I want everyone to know?
Yeah, it was a case of something that I felt needed to be shared and something that I loved sharing. So they just kind of dovetailed really nicely. So when I was 27, the main problem that I'd had since I was sort of 10, 11 is, first of all, I had real difficulties just expressing how I actually felt, and I had real difficulties trying to form a relationship. So I was putting all the energy in, I was putting all the effort in, but for whatever reason, that area of my life was just blocked. And so at 27, I thought, okay, how am I going to approach this? How am I going to deal with this? And that's when I was in a seminar with the neurosurgeon, Dr. Palomar, that I talked about. And we were in the session and it was talking about emotions. So I was like, oh, I'm not sure about this. I'm going to hide at the back of the class. So there was me hiding at the back of the class, trying to keep my head down. And then Dr. Palomar says, we're going to do a live demo. So I'm going to pick someone from the class. So there's me looking down, sweating, sort of trying to pretend I'm reading my notes. And lo and behold, I get called up to the front of the class. And just on the way to the class, like that long walk up to the top, I can feel my heart starting to race. I could feel myself sweating. And a couple of minutes later, I'm at the front of the class with the rest of my colleagues and people I didn't know. And I was asked some questions referring to the most painful experience I'd ever had. And that sort of completely caught me off guard. And after a few more questions, just completely out of the blue, I had like a real life flashback from when I was 11 and from when my parents divorced. And it was almost like I was back in the moment again, tears, not shrieks. It wasn't pretty, I'll say that. And that really gave me an insight into there was this thing sitting there that I had no awareness of. And so I found a trauma specialist. I had one session, and then 10 days later, I met my wife. And for me, that was just like my whole world changed just by working on trauma. So that was the incentive that I needed.
Yeah, wow. As you were saying the story, I got goosebumps all over my body. I felt the emotions. That would have been so deep. I mean, that walking towards the stage would have been probably the longest walk in your life.
Yes. Yeah.
And the sweat and the like, just the thought about it all. And wow, it made you be raw and vulnerable, didn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it wasn't voluntary. I didn't really know what I was signing up for, but the impact of that was just so intense, and I completely forgot the class was there. I had no awareness that like people were watching me. I was just in this moment from when I was 11, and it took me the rest of the day to recover. But that evening, I just sort of had a little bit of a chat with myself and was like, okay, this is something that I really need to deal with. And I think not many people are going to have the experience where they're called up to a front of the class and get questioned on it. So that made me think, if that didn't happen for me, how long would it have taken, or would it have happened that actually I would have got that insight? And so I think it's so difficult for people when they have symptoms where they're not sure where the cause is, because often it's trauma of some nature. And now I don't necessarily mean trauma with a capital T, you know, one of those horrendous, awful events. Often what I mean is an experience that just overwhelmed us, that our mind thought, okay, this is threatening, so we'll protect and lock down that area. And I think that's just really interesting when it comes to trauma.
Yeah, I like that you define that, because when people think trauma, exactly what you said, we think it's the trauma of the capital T, the big things that happen. So most people go, well, you know what, Danny or Mihaela, I've never been through trauma. I'm fine. But I'm pretty sure if you sat down with them, you'll be able to pinpoint a few things in their life which could have been trauma.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, where when you talk through my bio at the beginning, you actually phrased it as painful experiences. And often I'll talk to someone in terms of a painful experience rather than trauma. Because if I say to someone, oh, did you have any painful experiences? They'll go, oh, when I was 13, X, Y, Z, and they can really relate to it. But sometimes trauma is just maybe too big. So I think it's just being mindful that actually sometimes a small trauma, if they accumulate over time, can really impact us in many different ways.
Yeah, and I like that you said accumulate over time, because you may have one painful experience, another painful experience, and it builds on and it builds on. And that in itself can be traumatic, just the burden of these experiences.
Yeah. And they just, when we have the initial trauma or painful experience, each time that gets re-triggered, then it just sort of becomes a bigger and a bigger issue for us. Even though the actual origin is that one event, it just tends to generalize, and all of a sudden it's 15 years later and we're saying things like, it always happens when I'm doing X, or nothing ever changes for me in context Y. And then we're kind of stuck, and there's no way to follow the breadcrumbs back to the origin unless we know what questions to ask and what approaches to help us get there.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that with us, Danny. Danny, when we talk about health, right, in particular optimal health, what does that look like for you? If someone said to you, Danny, are you in optimal health? What boxes would you have to tick to be in optimal health?
And I think that's a really important thing to discover for yourself, because everyone has different ideas. One of the big drivers for me is how I feel in my body. So not necessarily my weight, but when I'm in front of the mirror, do I feel like I'm in good health? And probably that's the most visible sign for me and a lot of people, because I know if I go past a certain point in terms of my nutrition or my diet, then I don't feel like myself anymore, and then I feel like I'm so far away from health that I'm immediately driven to get back on it. So in terms of outward expression, for me, definitely it's my body composition and just sort of how I feel when I look at myself in the mirror. In terms of the mental side of things, for me, that's actually just feeling calm on a consistent basis. So we're all going to have spikes, we're all going to have ups and downs, but if I'm relatively calm on a consistent basis, for me, I know I'm in good health. And if I'm feeling well physically and I'm calm mentally, then a lot of the other components of health, like nutrition and exercise, they must be in good shape in order to get me there. So those are the kind of the two bits that I tend to focus on.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Danny. I know we've spoken a little bit about the topic already by starting the conversation, but relationship trauma, what is it doing to your health? Today's topic, I'm so excited to talk about it because as we've mentioned at the start, a lot of us think, think about health and then go, well, how does trauma affect my health? It doesn't affect my health, but we're here to talk more about it and say it does actually affect your health. Would you agree with that, Danny?
100%. And I think the challenge up until maybe 5 years ago is that the neuroscience didn't build the link between emotions and health. But now we actually have that really strong bridge. And so I can say with absolute certainty that actually traumatic experiences do impact health, work performance, so many different areas of life. So shall we go on a bit of a deep dive in terms of how we get there?
Let's do it.
Okay. So this is the concept that initially changed my life as well. So it kind of makes sense if we explain it, first of all, in terms of how it works, and then how it impacts our nervous system. So the key topic that we're talking about is something known as emotional memory images. So these are called EMIs, or emotional memory images. And essentially what happens is when we're involved in an event, an experience, or even a set of circumstances that has an intense emotional charge, whatever the emotion is, as a safety mechanism, our mind takes a snapshot of where we are, what we're doing, who we're with, the actions that are taking place, and our mind then stores that on a subconscious danger list, almost like a warning system going forwards. Now, as well as that mental snapshot, it also contains all of the chemistry that we experienced at that moment. So it's going to be cortisol, it's going to be adrenaline, it's going to be the classic stress response. So what happens is that emotional memory image is generated after the experience, and then it gets stored. And when that storage takes place, we almost have a little bit of amnesia around it. So it kind of fades away from our memory, but subconsciously it gets stored. And then as we go forwards in life, anytime we're exposed to or we're in a context that is similar to or symbolic of the original event, the same stress response gets triggered. So let's use our relationship example. So let's say when you were growing up in the family home, the relationship dynamic that you observed between mum and dad was physically violent, for example. Now, observing that and experiencing that for many people would be considered traumatic. So the mind takes a snapshot of a relationship and the experience that happens. So then some 20 years later, when you're in a relationship yourself and there's maybe a challenge or a confrontation that comes up, that original event gets triggered at a below conscious level, flooding you full of cortisol and adrenaline, which means you're no longer present in your relationship because you're triggered by the past. Does that kind of make sense?
Makes sense, 100%. I love how you've explained the fact of that your mind takes a snapshot and it stores it. And with all of that, it takes into account where you've been, who was around, even maybe what you've smelt, what you've heard, the colors around, all that thing. It takes it in and it puts it in like a little danger zone area in a folder that's like danger. And then our brain can just go into that folder later on in life and go, oh, that was dangerous. And you just freeze. In a way.
Yes, exactly. And freeze is a very powerful response when it comes to trauma. Now, polyvagal theory, which kind of helps to explain what the nervous system does when we experience trauma, it also brings up one concept which is known as neuroception. And that's when your mind is scanning your environment for those hints of danger. So if you're then in a context like a relationship, then your mind is scanning continuously for relationship triggers that remind you of that past experience. And then when they trigger, you get like an echo of that original event. So your system gets those same chemicals. Now, if we think about what happens in terms of the biochemistry, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis, is a key component of our stress response. Now, when we experience a stressor, the HPA axis triggers a cascade of events which releases the adrenaline into the system. Now, when that happens occasionally, our HPA axis can compensate and it can stay in good health. But when it's chronic, the HPA axis then starts to become dysregulated, and then it can no longer manage those stressful events. And now we've got excess cortisol running through the system on a regular basis. We've got excess adrenaline running through on a regular basis. And now, thankfully, we have all the research to show that cortisol over long periods of time affects the immune system, it affects inflammation, then adrenaline, it affects muscle fatigue and muscle tension. So now we can see that trauma affects the HPA axis, and when that becomes dysregulated, it affects so many different areas of health that it can impact so many different conditions, ranging from chronic inflammatory conditions all the way to potentially things like dementia. So it's a scary and exciting time in terms of the impact that trauma has.
Yeah, wow. Let's go to the point where you said that we may be if we're in a relationship, we may be scanning for those triggers. That's not really a safe place to be, which then clearly triggers the stress response. But for your body or for your mind to be scanning for those trigger things whilst in a relationship, that doesn't sound too safe.
It certainly doesn't sound safe, and it's also very energy intensive. So I think of the analogy almost like a computer sometimes. I know that's a bit of an outdated analogy in some places, but actually for this it works. Because if your hard drive, if you like, has to dedicate 2/3 of its power trying to scan the environment for signs of danger, that leaves you very little space, both physically and mentally, to do the things that you want to do. So you might be eating well, you might be trying to exercise, but if your system is continually focused on survival and threat, then your ability to make the most of all of those wonderful health promoting things gets compromised, and then all of a sudden health starts to get more and more difficult. So that scanning of the environment, which just happens at a below conscious level, the only way that we resolve that is by working through and processing the trauma so that actually there's nothing to scan. Because if there's nothing to scan, all of your resources can go towards what you want, and for anyone listening to this, that's going to be optimal health.
I was going to say, for anyone listening, would be like, wow, that would be amazing. Like, because some individuals may not even know that they're scanning for these things, but they're just so exhausted. And as you've mentioned, the HPA axis impacts so many things like our immunity, our brain, our gut function, so many different aspects. So all of a sudden, someone has had a traumatic event or a negative event in their life at the start of their life, like you said, made the example of seeing their parents, and then they're in a relationship, and then they're scanning, and then all of a sudden they come up with an autoimmune disease, and they don't know where it came from.
Exactly, and it can manifest in so many different ways that it's really quite difficult to try and connect, okay, this autoimmune disease that I'm struggling to that event back then. But the dots are slowly being filled in. But yeah, I totally understand from an outside perspective, that connection can seem really vague and ambiguous, but actually it makes perfect sense when we understand how the mechanism works.
Yeah, I was going to say some people might be like, well, Danny, what me having chronic pain linked to back when I was 11 with what my dad or my mum said to me? That makes no sense. But the way you've explained it, you've linked it together.
Yeah, and it's the way that the nervous system functions, and that also makes sense why if our HPA axis can compensate for 10, 15 years, but then it goes into dysregulation 20 years later, that then explains why these health issues generally tend to appear in our 40s or 50s, because our body has been compensating for so long that it finally reaches the point where it can no longer do it effectively, and then the health issues start to manifest. So it's not that they've all of a sudden came on during the 40s. It's actually that they've been building and building, and then it finally reaches the point where the condition is expressed in some way.
Yeah, because our body, our emotions, they keep count, don't they? And just because it happened when you were 10 or 15 doesn't mean it's going to show up in your 20s. It may even show up in your 50s all of a sudden, but it's key to understand those trigger points.
Yes, and understanding the trigger points is often the first step for many people. So following that sort of relationship example, let's say you have been married for a few years, and every now and again when you have a big fallout, your partner gives you a certain glare and a certain facial expression. Now, it may be the case that during those early experiences, your mum and your dad did a similar facial expression, like we all do when we're angry. And so that tends to cause a small trigger. So now we've got little triggers going on, and then something will happen that will take us past our emotional threshold, and then it'll blow up into a big event. But it's often the smaller ones that piece together and accumulate over time.
That's a really interesting example you used there, because not many people would even think about that, to make a connection between the glare that your partner might give you compared to someone in your childhood who may have given that to you and caused a negative experience.
Exactly. And one thing that I see in terms of a business context is if you were young or when you were young, if your father had a very assertive or stern tone, maybe 15, 20 years later, when you're in a high intensity work environment, if your senior or your boss has a similar type of personality, then the criticism or the feedback that they give you can trigger that same stress response from when you were younger as well. So now it's affecting relationships, it's affecting work performance, and it all stems back to those early painful experiences. And I'm not saying this happens in every case, but often if there is a consistent issue, like there's something about my boss that just I can't work around, or when my partner does X, I just lose my cool. Those are kind of little breadcrumbs, if you like, that actually the origin of those come from way back when, rather than just in the moment.
Yeah. So following those breadcrumbs, is it just sitting down and thinking about those questions that you said, like when my boss does this or my partner does this, this is what happens? Is that kind of like the first point where you sit down and you kind of look for patterns in your own behavior and then see where kind of they may be coming from? Is that the first things that you would kind of do to figure out if there was a traumatic event that happened?
We can make it a little bit more methodical even than that. So the first thing that I recommend is that we need to pick a context, because all sort of symptoms and issues are context dependent. So something that happens in the family environment is probably unlikely to impact you in, let's say, a fitness environment when you're older, but the same context tends to stay true. So what I often recommend people do is, first of all, identify what the outward expression of their challenges is. So is it an anger response? Is it a freeze response, as you mentioned earlier? And then identify what are the things that tend to happen that cause that event. and then we go through a timeline exercise. So let's say you're 50 years old, draw a line across an A4 page and you divide it into 5-year segments. And then just slowly you work back through those segments and identify, were there any particular moments that stand out during that time as being painful, difficult, or potentially traumatic? And what's quite remarkable is that when you actually sit down and really sit with those time periods, your mind has all of the answers, but it needs a little bit of space and a little bit of time to sit with those questions in order to get the answers. But the answers are there. So it takes a little bit of work, but actually it can give you some really powerful answers.
Yeah, I mean, just the whole exercise in itself can bring up a lot of things. And some people may not want to do that because they may not be ready. Have you seen that happen, Danny?
Yeah, it's often a case of when someone has maybe done some previous therapy work, then often they're much more comfortable sitting down and doing that type of exercise because they've already either started the journey or they've got some tools and resources to work on it. If maybe they're completely new to this area, then actually it can be a little bit daunting, and then maybe the place to start is just looking at those triggers and those symptoms that show up and actually getting some help for the next piece. So there's different elements that you can do by yourself. You can do it all by yourself, but as you mentioned, it's depending on what your background is and how comfortable you feel doing that. Because what we don't want to do is put someone in a situation where they feel overwhelmed by it. So it sort of depends on what your background is.
Yeah, and I mean, just the exercise itself can cause stress for some individuals as they may experience the feelings that they felt during the time that those situations happened. And it's quite interesting. So the individuals gets a piece of paper out, they do it in 5-year segments, they look at painful experiences or traumatic experiences that may have happened to them. And they write them down. Do they go into a lot of detail? Do they just write dot points? What are your thoughts about people going back to what happened? Is there a need to do that?
It's not about really making extensive notes or details. Sometimes I ask people to put a small X for a painful event, and then maybe a larger X if it was a bigger one. And then you don't necessarily need to go into it, but you can kind of get an idea just looking at your piece of paper. Oh, between the ages of 10 and 15, there's quite a few X's there. And then that kind of gives an idea about maybe a challenging period that might still be impacting on you.
Yeah, I really like that. Just putting that little X or a big X, that definitely puts a lot of pressure of the tasks for some individuals.
Yeah, and this is just for you, so you can do it in whatever way works for you, but just giving yourself that visual representation is often enough for you to then think, okay, now what approaches, what tools, what strategy will I use to then start to work on it? So it's often just a helpful first step, but it's certainly not something that would then lead to a resolution of them. It just gives you greater awareness.
Yeah, it gives us greater awareness. And I mean, the awareness is key to healing, because if we're not aware of it, we keep repeating the same issues, the same scenarios in our life, don't we?
Well, I firmly believe that we'll keep repeating the lesson until we're ready to listen. So when we can actually take that on board and we can grow and expand from it, then those repeated patterns tend to fall away. If we continue to often ignore them, then the lesson will get louder and louder and louder until something happens or occurs where we have no choice but to deal with it. So I often think it's wiser to deal with them when they're whispers rather than when they're sort of screaming at you. And I certainly found out. Yeah, exactly. Well, I certainly found out through the screaming method in front of a group of people, and I wouldn't recommend that. So when they're whispers, I think that's a better way to do it.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks for sharing that with us, Danny. So, you're faced with this A3, A4, however big or little you want the piece of paper to be, with how many ever X on you have on there. And some of them may be subconscious, you may not even know. But what happens then? Like, what would you do with individuals with these X's? Like, how can we influence and change our mind to resolve past all of these pains and traumas once they're there in front of us?
And this is where we come full circle back to the idea of those emotional memory images. So the work that I do with people struggling with trauma is I help them access the emotional memory image from the original event, and then guide them through a process of sort of clearing it, processing it, updating it, adding new learning to it, so that all of the old chemistry can then start to dissipate and fade away. So while the emotional memory image is still in the same form when it was installed, if you like, it continues to trigger those same events. But just often by bringing an awareness to the emotional memory image and realizing that that's a mental representation of the past, that's not happening now, then we can start to disconnect from that, and then the emotion starts to soften and fade away. So that's why often if a client has an X on a piece of paper, I rarely need to know much more information. As long as they are aware of the information, then they can work through it. Now, there are different modalities and different exercises that anyone can go through to work through and resolve the trauma themselves. But without sort of training in that area, it's not something that I'd recommend. So it's certainly something that you can do individually, but for the majority of people, now we've got something to work with. It's just about how do we clear that emotional memory image so then you can move forwards without that barrier, without that block.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you said, as long as there's an X there, there's no need for you to know that detail. Of course, there's going to be individuals who are going to share detail with you, and that's perfectly fine. However, there might be some individuals who still are not comfortable with it, and marking the X spot, as long as they know you're able to work with them to clear it out. That's amazing.
And that's I believe, one of the biggest barriers to people getting help. And it was certainly an issue that I wrestled with, is I know I've got this challenge, but what I don't really want to do is go into detail and talk about it. I kind of just want it dealt with, but I don't want to expand and get lost in it. So by working exactly, yeah. So by working with emotional memory images, we minimize the amount of detail that needs to be shared, which then means the client can actually keep most things relatively private. Now, of course, we'll need little bits of information and we'll need little bits of data, but it's completely different to sort of laying down on the couch and then going, okay, tell me what happened. Because that, for many people, is a big barrier to getting help, and I totally understand that.
Yeah, a lot of people will be like, well, I don't really want to talk about it, or I haven't built a relationship with you to trust you. I haven't even told the people around me about these things. I'm ashamed. I'm embarrassed. I feel guilty. Whatever those emotions are coming up with it, it's dealt with without the other person helping you needing to know about it.
And often at that point, when that initial emotional memory image has been dealt with, that they then start to feel more comfortable to then share it with those people around them, because actually the guilt or the shame has been sort of processed, and now they can see it. Okay, that was an event that happened, but the main thing is they can choose how they deal with it. They might want to just move on and not talk about it again, or they might want to share it, but they've got more choice. So rather than being in a place where I'm so ashamed about that I can't talk about it, they might be in a case of, now I've dealt with that, I don't need to talk about it. But they've got the option. So it's all about giving people the flexibility to choose what works for them.
Yeah, the option, freedom, and flexibility of choosing your way to heal through these experiences or trauma. So, Danny, do you do CBT or EMDR or other techniques that you can share with us to work through this process with the patients?
Yeah. So EMDR, so eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, that's a very helpful tool because it works directly with the emotional memory images. So it allows us again to use a process where we don't need to share content, we don't need to share details, but we can rapidly accelerate how we can resolve painful or difficult experiences. So EMDR is a really powerful modality, and it's probably the most extensively researched in terms of actually how it helps. And a recent piece of research suggested that the main way that it helps is by actually clearing those mental images. So it fits in perfectly with the emotional memory image topic. In terms of CBT, I've worked with and sort of trained in trauma-focused CBT, and it has helpful ways to navigate certain issues and certain problems, but it's certainly a part of a bigger toolkit rather than being a focus of. And I mean, over here in the UK, if you're struggling with trauma, one of the primary methods will be solely focused on CBT. And I think that provides a partial solution, which is why so many people have ongoing problems and then have health issues repeat themselves. Whereas when we use it as part of a bigger toolkit, then just like that, it can help in certain times, but it's not the be all and end all. So CBT and EMDR are really helpful tools, and there are many others as well, but as long as they're part of a holistic approach to improving health, that's what I'd say is the key message there.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that to us. And some people may have never heard about CBT or EMDR, so it really helps you explaining it to them, or they may have been offered those techniques by their practitioner to deal with trauma or their emotions or whatever is happening. Danny, what would you recommend working with? Would it be a combination of those things? Would it be a philosophy that you follow? What is a way to deal with the trauma or experiences that have made you feel this way?
I think it's really important that we appreciate everyone has different values. Everyone has their own value system, and they have certain things that are more important to them and a higher priority, and certain things that are less important to them. So when we can tailor the therapeutic approach to fit that individual's values, that's when I think we get the most effective and optimal results. So if someone is really comfortable talking about what happened and they would like to verbalize and vocalize elements of it, then they may find a more psychotherapeutic approach is helpful. For other people, if they really want the end result and they want to do it as quickly as is safely possible, then we've got many other different routes. So there isn't a right and a wrong way to do it, although I would say there are approaches that are more effective and approaches that are less effective. So it's really about getting clear on what's important to you in a healing modality, and then finding someone and an approach that aligns with that. So a bit of an on the fence answer there, but it really does depend on what's important to the person on the healing journey.
It is on the fence answer, but I love it because it gives, again, the freedom, the flexibility to choose the way that you wish to heal. Danny, are you able to give us an example, because you've dealt with thousands of individuals and have helped them through their trauma? Are you able to provide us with an example of what's happened so the audience listening can kind of connect with that?
Yeah. So I'll use a very recent example. So I was working with a lady recently. So she's about 40. And just for argument's sake, we'll call her Sarah, just so we can give her a name. And obviously that's not her real name. Now, Sarah initially came to me because she was struggling with anger around dealing with her kids. So she had 3 children, and she was finding that she was having angry outbursts, and she was finding that at work, where she used to be able to really focus clearly, now her head was clouded, she was tired a lot of the time, and she just couldn't really figure out what was going on. Now, when we first started to speak, she was actually already really aware that during her early childhood, she had some quite difficult and challenging family dynamics. So when we started to look at what is it that causes her anger, she would immediately access emotional memory images from the way her mum and her dad engaged with her. And even though she resented that treatment, that's the exact same thing she was now doing towards her children. And that's where we say, if you haven't learnt the lesson, it'll get louder. So we had these old images from when she was young that was then affecting the way that she was raising her children. And it was just being manifested in sort of anger and sort of foggy-headedness. So when we helped her to process those images and to help update them and help them to sort of disconnect from the emotion, then she immediately started to feel that she could get, or she could be, calmer and more present around her children. And then the things that they were doing that were triggering her were actually, she was now able to observe them rather than reacting to them. And I'm not pretending in any way with 3 little children, you're not going to get frustrated or angry at times, but her response was measured. It was more controlled, and she felt in control. So then we started to delve a little bit deeper, and then she mentioned that I tend to find myself with the same type of man over and over again, and he's emotionally unavailable. So as we work to trace that back, what did she perceive she lacked and missed when she was younger? She had very little emotional connection with her dad. So there were specific moments where she had images from when she was little, where she tried to reach out to her dad, where she perceived she was rejected or dismissed or turned down. And then when she was with partners, she was getting the same type of response, which was then triggering the same stress from when she was younger. So it took a little bit of navigating and a little bit of work, but actually within sort of, I think it was 12 sessions, so it was just under 3 months, we got her calm and relaxed around her children. Her relationship with her partner then transformed. He then came to see me as well. So then we started to work on some things to help him. And then the whole dynamic changed. And all of it really stemmed from her early childhood experiences that were just left as painful moments from the past. And when we dealt with those, her present then started to change as well.
Yeah, those painful moments from the past. And I mean, everything that you just spoke about as an example, a lot of individuals can relate to. If that anger is towards their kids, their partner, their mum, their dad, siblings, colleagues, whoever that is, people can relate to that scenario that you just mentioned. And it's interesting that by helping deal with those painful memories from the past, her nervous system just calmed down, which then essentially worked with the HPA axis, which improved maybe her gut function, her immune system, her musculoskeletal pain, and so forth would have been helped out as a kind of like a little thank you. The nervous system had like a
huge impact on her sleep. Huge impact on her sleep, which then allowed all of the other bodily processes to kind of do their job a little bit better as well.
100%. And this is exactly why I love that I got you on the Natural podcast, because we can see that, just taking supplements or food or things like that may not be the complete picture to healing and health. It may be looking at your emotions, painful experiences, trauma to get that optimal health.
I think there's very rarely one solution to an issue. And particularly when it comes to health, and even at the beginning when you said, well, what does your optimal health look like? So there are so many different elements that help someone to feel healthy. And as you mentioned, supplements may play a key role. But if they're trying to replace things that are struggling because of previous trauma, then you're going to struggle to get the result that you want. If we can bring emotions into the picture just as a component of, then it gives us more things that we can work on, which will allow us to get to our health goals in a easier, more sustainable way.
Yeah. One question that came to mind when you were talking about so-called Sarah, that, her parents were treating her that way, so she has treated her kids. And we see this occur a lot of the times. It's like, why am I reenacting my parents' so-called faults, if you want to call them, and then doing them to other people that I love?
So the saying that had the biggest impact on me in terms of this area of life is, whatever we condemn, we breed. So the more we resent a particular behavior, the more we put energy into resenting it, the more we end up doing it ourselves. And one of the ways that we can look at that is in terms of our mental imagery again. So for example, if I say, whatever you do, don't think about a purple elephant, then immediately the mind has to conjure the picture to then dismiss it. So if we're putting our energy into, I don't want to shout at my kids, we have to create that picture to then dismiss it. But by the time we've created the picture, the visual cortex has processed it, and then our HPA axis is then already responding to it. So the more we think about what we resent and dislike, the more energy we'll put into it, the more likely it is that it will manifest. And part of that is because of that sort of visual process, but also because we haven't taken that bit of feedback to turn it into a learning experience yet, so it keeps coming up. So when we change our imagery and we help it to become part of our journey, so we help neutralize and release the old emotions, then we're less likely to repeat that behavior.
Wow. As soon as you said the purple elephant, there was a huge purple elephant in my mind.
So imagine on a regular basis having a picture of not shouting at your children. So that's just going to keep firing and firing and firing and firing. And over time, it's then going to start to show itself.
Yeah, that's crazy. The other thing that came to mind is back to that piece of paper of the crosses. What if there's an individual that may only have 2 small little crosses? Is there such thing as generational trauma? Maybe in their past, the generations have gone through a lot more trauma than they themselves have, and it's been passed on.
I think this is a really fascinating area. And it's, again, one that research is starting to give us more insights into. And there's a really interesting book called It Didn't Start With You. And that kind of talks about some of the background research that shows when we have a traumatic experience, that traumatic experience then causes genetic changes to help us cope with that type of experience, which then gets passed on to the next generation, which then means certain elements of previous trauma may then be being transmitted down through different generations. And there's lots of different research to show that if, for example, a parent had severe PTSD, the chances of their offspring then having mental health challenges then significantly increases. So it's certainly not something that is like a life sentence. So if you had traumatic events in the family tree, for example, it doesn't mean you're stuck with them, but it may in some cases mean that there's some work to do in terms of releasing that what wasn't even yours. So I think it's a really fascinating area, and those people that have gone through it have had some really significant breakthroughs, and I think it'll continue to evolve and develop. So maybe that one for me needs a little bit more research for me to really get on board with it, but I'm very open to it.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's definitely research there to be done and a bit more information. But yes, I've read the same thing that you have in regards to trauma changing genetics and it being passed on. It's mind-blowing. And
it is, yeah.
It's definitely an area to keep an eye out on. Danny, you've shared some absolutely amazing information with us today. To sum it up, what would be a few practical tips, 2, 3, 4, however many you want to share for the audience to incorporate to deal with relationship trauma? And I know that's a big question in itself, but if you can sum it down to a few, what would that be?
I think the easiest step to begin with is to become as aware as you can of the mental imagery and the mental pictures that you are creating. So if there are sort of disagreements or if there's confrontations, when we go away and stew on it, often we start to create all of these worst case scenarios, all of these stressful, painful images, and then we direct all of that energy back towards our partner. Whereas when we actually become more aware of the images that we're creating, we can start to create different pictures and we can start to move our focus. So that's something that we can really, really easily do in terms of our partners to actually help ourselves stay more in control. In terms of a more broader perspective, if we're in a position where our nervous system is chronically stressed, then small things that our partner does is likely to trigger a larger response. Whereas when we can do things to help our whole nervous system feel calmer and more comfortable, then we've got much more flexibility in terms of those little niggles that might happen. So whether that be for you exercise or whether it be specific breathing exercises or meditation focuses, that can help your nervous system stress lower, which makes you more adaptable to those people around you. And then I would say the final element is if you're at a place where it's really hindering you, what are some of the ways that you can do to actually start to work on those stresses? So there is lots of sort of self-hypnosis out there, or there is lots of hypnotherapy recordings that you can get access to that can again start to help you on that journey. So if we move you from managing your mental imagery to helping your nervous system stay calmer, and if appropriate, doing those extra things to help some more, then your relationship quality will significantly improve just from a few small steps.
Wow, you summed that up absolutely amazing at the end. And I love that you put in there nourishing the nervous system. Absolutely key. And that's where putting all those things together, we're able to achieve a healthy relationship, but also a healthy us,
Yes.
emotionally, mentally, physically, whatever that looks like. So we're not just doing this to keep the relationship healthy, but to keep us healthy. So I think that's absolutely key, Danny.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your story, your experience with us today on Natural Health Podcast. We really, really appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to add to the audience about relationship trauma or anything that you want to add in?
I would leave with sort of one idea, and that would be it's infinitely harder to change something you resent compared to something that you can appreciate. So the more we can turn challenges and roadblocks into things that are on our way or part of our journey, then the less we get bogged down. So if we can find appreciation in challenges, particularly in our relationship, then it'll help everything go more smoothly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Danny. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put your website and how people can contact you on the show notes below. Are you able to let us know quickly how people can contact you?
Yeah, so the best way is to go to my website, which is www.thetraumaexpert.co.uk. And if you go to the website, you can download my book for free, and that'll give you an idea of actually just a greater insight into what we've talked about today, and that's probably a great first step.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Danny, for sharing your knowledge with us today. Thank you for joining us on Natural Health Podcast, and remember, the missing link between failure and success is your health. opinion of Mahela Raguse and is for information purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. It is not intended to provide medical advice or take the place of medical advice or any current treatment you're undertaking. Consult your own medical professionals for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the Natural Health Podcast. It is advised that you consult your doctor or healthcare professional in relation to any health concerns you may be having. Mahela Raguse does not take responsibility for any health consequences which occur from a person listening, viewing, or reading this content. Under no circumstances shall the Natural Health Podcast, Mahela Raguse, any guests or contributors to the Natural Health Podcast, or any employees, associates, or affiliates of Mahela Raguse be responsible for damages arising from the information provided on the Natural Health Podcast. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice to treat any medical conditions in either yourself or others. Please note, if you're taking prescription, do not stop your medication or start a new protocol, including but not limited to supplements, diet, lifestyle changes without consulting a doctor or healthcare professional. If you or any person has a medical concern, you should consult with your healthcare provider or seek other professional medical advice. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something that you have read or heard on the Natural Health Podcast or in any linked materials. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or emergency services immediately. Neither Mahela Raguse nor the publisher of this content takes responsibility for the possible health consequences of any person or persons reading or listening or following the information in the educational content.